It is a long journey to this moment. All I can say is a very special thank you.
There are names in Hollywood that time refuses to erase. Sidney Poitier is one of them, a man who broke barriers, who carried the weight of dignity on his shoulders, and who stood as the very first black actor to win the Academy Award for Best Actor. His grace, his courage, and his poise under pressure turned him into more than just a movie star. He became a symbol of hope for millions. Audiences remember him in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, In the Heat of the Night, and to Sir, with Love. To the world, he was an icon, a legend, a pioneer. But behind the bright lights and golden trophies was another story, one the cameras never captured. A story of 6 daughters who grew up not with a Hollywood idol, but with a man they called Dad. What was it like to live under such a colossal shadow? To carry a last name that opened doors yet closed others? Some of his daughters embraced the spotlight, others ran from it, and one was taken far too soon. Their lives reveal a truth few dare to ask. When a father becomes a legend, what is left for his children to become? Before Sidney Poitier became a household name, he was a young husband building a life far away from Hollywood's glare. In 1950, he married Juanita Hardy, and together they had 4 daughters: Beverly, Pamela, Sherri, and Gina. Their childhood unfolded during the years when Sidney was clawing his way into history, facing prejudice, rejection, and finally triumph. For these girls, the world saw their father as a trailblazer, but at home, he was often absent, on set, on stage, or traveling for causes bigger than himself. By 1965, that marriage ended. A decade later, Sidney found love again with Canadian actress Joanna Shimkus. With her, he raised 2 more daughters, Anika and Sidney Tamiia. Unlike their older sisters, these 2 were born after Sidney had already conquered Hollywood. They grew up in a more stable environment, with a father who had matured into an icon and a family that could afford a different kind of life. 6 daughters, 2 different households, 2 different eras of their father's extraordinary journey. And yet, every one of them shared the same invisible burden, being known first as Sidney Poitier's daughter. Some chose art, some chose silence, and all carried the expectations that come with a legendary name. Number 6. Beverly Poitier Henderson. Beverly Poitier Henderson was the first daughter of Sidney Poitier and Juanita Hardy, born in the early 1950s, long before her father stood on the Academy Awards stage as a pioneer. She arrived in a world where her father was still struggling for recognition, and in many ways, Beverly's life would mirror that quiet, complicated beginning. As a child, she grew up watching her father rise from anonymity into history-making fame. But that rise came at a cost. While millions saw Sidney as a symbol of progress, Beverly felt the distance of a man pulled between family and destiny. There were moments of love and pride, of course, but also an unspoken pressure. How do you grow into yourself when your father is already larger than life? Unlike many celebrity children, Beverly did not chase the spotlight. Instead, she chose the written word. She became a published author, known for her novel Nana, weaving stories rich with psychological and emotional depth. Her voice was thoughtful, intimate, and distinct from her father's cinematic legacy. And yet, while Sidney's performances were celebrated around the globe, Beverly's work slipped quietly into obscurity. Rarely reviewed, often overlooked. This contrast became her defining challenge. The world cheered Sidney's every triumph, but Beverly lived in near silence, trying to carve out a space where she was seen not as the daughter of a legend, but as a woman with her own voice. She married, raised a family, and deliberately kept her distance from Hollywood. Some call her private, others say forgotten. but perhaps it's more accurate to say she chose depth over display. Her life is not one of tragedy or grand achievement. It exists in the space between. And in that quiet middle ground lies its power, the courage to live without applause. Beverly Poitier Henderson reminds us that not all legacies are meant for the spotlight. Some are written in silence, waiting for those willing to listen. Number 5. Pamela Poitier. Pamela Poitier, the second daughter of Sidney Poitier and Juanita Hardy, was born into a very different reality than her older sister Beverly. By the time Pamela entered the world, Sidney was no longer a struggling actor. He was on his way to becoming a household name, the man audiences would one day revere as a symbol of dignity and strength. But that fame created a paradox for Pamela. While her father belonged to the world, she longed for him to belong more to her. From an early age, Pamela was drawn to the arts. She followed the natural pull of creativity, pursuing acting and later branching into filmmaking. For a time, it seemed she might carry her father's torch into a new generation. She appeared in stage productions and films, testing her craft in the same world that had crowned Sidney a legend. Yet Hollywood is rarely kind to the children of icons. Every opportunity carried a shadow. Every performance was compared not to her peers, but to her father's monumental legacy. That constant scrutiny weighed heavily. Pamela's career was marked by promise, but also by barriers, roles that never materialized, projects that went unseen, and beyond the professional challenges lay the personal cost. Growing up with a father whose career demanded his presence elsewhere often meant emotional distance at home. Pamela has hinted in interviews that this left scars. The ache of watching the world adore a man you sometimes felt you barely knew. Yet unlike her older sister, who chose quiet retreat, Pamela refused to disappear. She stayed in the fight, using art as a tool for self-expression and later turning her voice toward healing, heritage, and community projects. She became known not just as Sidney Poitier's daughter, but as a woman who spoke openly about identity, race, and the struggle to define oneself under the crushing weight of expectation. Her life has not been defined by blockbuster success or tabloid scandal, but by resilience. Pamela's story is one of survival and perseverance, proof that even when the spotlight burns too brightly, there is courage in refusing to let it snuff you out. Number 4. Sherri Poitier. Sherri Poitier, the third daughter of Sidney Poitier and Juanita Hardy, has perhaps the quietest story of them all. Born in the years when her father's fame was no longer rising but blazing, she came into a world where Sidney was already a celebrated figure, constantly in the public eye. For Sherri, this meant growing up with the glare of the spotlight nearby, yet choosing, intentionally or instinctively, not to step into it. Unlike her sisters Beverly and Pamela, Sherri never pursued a career in the arts. She did not chase auditions, nor did she grant interviews or write books. In fact, very little is known about her personal or professional life, and that absence has become her story. While some of her siblings wrestled with fame, Sherri chose a path of near-total privacy. She became, in the eyes of the public, almost invisible. But invisibility does not mean insignificance. Her decision to remain outside the frame of celebrity culture may have been a form of self-preservation. Growing up in a fractured household, her parents' marriage ended in 1965. Sherri likely saw firsthand the cost of being tethered too closely to a legend. By pulling away, she avoided the comparisons, the expectations, and the scrutiny that her siblings endured. Still, there are whispers of struggle, a sense of isolation, perhaps even the pain of being the forgotten daughter. In families touched by fame, attention is rarely equal, Some children are celebrated, others slip into the shadows. Sherri seemed to choose the shadows, but that choice came with loneliness of its own. And yet, in her silence, there is strength. Sherri reminds us that not every legacy must be lived in public view. Her life may not fill magazine covers or filmographies, but it carries its own radical message. Sometimes the most powerful act is to set boundaries and live life on your own terms. Number 3. Gina Poitier. Of all Sidney Poitier's daughters, Gina Poitier's story is perhaps the most heartbreaking because it ended too soon. Born in 1956 to Sidney and Juanita Hardy, Gina arrived at a time when her father's fame was soaring. Unlike Beverly and Pamela, who saw Sidney's early struggles, Gina entered a world where her father was already a global icon. But that did not mean life came easier. Gina chose a different path from Hollywood. While her father graced red carpets and film sets, she pursued a quiet, ordinary career, working in administrative and technical fields. Far from the spotlight, she built a life grounded in stability. She married, had children, and was remembered by those close to her as gentle, intelligent, and quietly driven. In a family defined by fame, Gina seemed to embrace the beauty of the everyday. But the shadow of her father's legacy was never far. Growing up as the daughter of a man celebrated worldwide must have carried its own weight, even if she kept those feelings private. Friends and family suggest that, like her sisters, she felt the pressure of expectations that no child could fully bear. Tragically, in 2018, Gina passed away at the age of 62. Her death did not spark headlines or lengthy tributes in the press. There were no Hollywood memorials, no global obituaries. Even in her passing, she remained almost invisible to the world that had celebrated her father so loudly. But for Sidney, then in his 90s, the loss was immeasurable. To outlive a child is perhaps the greatest grief any parent can know. Her story is not one of fame or scandal, but of a quiet life lived on her own terms, cut short before its time. Gina's legacy lies not in film or literature, but in the family she loved, the children she raised, and the gentle presence she brought into a household overshadowed by history. In remembering her, we are reminded that not every life must be extraordinary to matter deeply. Number 2. Anika Poitier. Anika Poitier, the elder daughter of Sidney Poitier and his second wife, Canadian actress Joanna Shimkus, was born into a very different world than her older half-sisters. By the time she arrived, Sidney was no longer the young actor struggling for roles or recognition. He was a symbol of dignity, a man who had already broken through Hollywood's toughest barriers. That meant Anika's childhood was surrounded by greater stability, comfort, and privilege. But privilege doesn't erase pressure. Unlike her sisters, who wrestled with whether to step into the spotlight, Anika chose a path behind the camera. She pursued writing and directing, crafting stories not as an actress in front of an audience, but as a storyteller shaping narratives from the shadows. It was, in many ways, a courageous decision. For a woman carrying one of Hollywood's most legendary last names, stepping into directing was both an embrace of her family's artistic legacy and a rejection of the constant comparisons that came with acting. Her early projects showed promise, intimate, thoughtful explorations of human relationships and culture. Yet, like many independent filmmakers, she faced the uphill battle of recognition. Some works were quietly released to niche audiences, while others never reached the public at all. For Anika, every step in her career carried the silent weight of expectation. When your father is Sidney Poitier, good is never enough. The world expects brilliance, always. Still, Anika's life was not only about career. She built a family of her own, and by all accounts, maintained a close and respectful bond with her father. In rare interviews, she spoke openly about the double-edged nature of her last name. A gift, yes, but also a responsibility. She revered her father, yet longed to be seen outside of his shadow. Today, Anika remains relatively private, continuing her creative work with steady determination. She may not be a household name, but her story resonates with authenticity. In choosing a quieter, more personal path, she has shown that legacy is not always about fame. It can also be about staying true to your own vision, even if no one is watching. Number 1. Sidney Tamiia Poitier. Of all Sidney Poitier's daughters, Sidney Tamiia is the one who stepped most directly into the spotlight. Born in 1973 to Sidney and Joanna Shimkus, she entered a very different Hollywood than the one her father had known. By then, Sidney was not just an actor, he was a legend. And from her very first steps into the world of entertainment, the weight of that legacy followed her. Sidney trained seriously for her craft, attending NYU's Tisch School of the Arts and honing her skills with determination. Her beauty, charisma, and talent quickly drew attention. She landed roles in television and film, appearing in Joan of Arcadia, Veronica Mars, and Quentin Tarantino's Death Proof. For a time, it seemed she might finally be the Poitier daughter, to truly inherit and carry forward her father's monumental place in Hollywood. But fame, especially when inherited, is rarely straightforward. Every audition, every review, every performance was filtered through the lens of her last name. Critics compared her mannerisms, her voice, even her presence on screen to Sidney's. While this offered her visibility, it also became a cage. She was never just Sidney. She was always the daughter of Sidney Poitier. Despite the scrutiny, Sidney built a career on her own terms. She married musician Dorian Hartsong, welcomed a child, and balanced motherhood with her ongoing work in television and film. Yet the breakthrough stardom many expected never fully arrived. Over time, she stepped back, choosing peace and authenticity over the relentless pursuit of fame. Her story is not one of failure, but of quiet triumph. She refused to let Hollywood define her solely by her last name. Instead, she chose family, balance, and the dignity of charting her own course. In that choice, Sidney Tamiia Poitier embodies the same grace her father carried throughout his life. Grace not in chasing the spotlight, but in knowing when to step out of it. When we step back and look at the lives of Sidney Poitier's 6 daughters, Beverly, Pamela, Sherri, Gina, Anika, and Sidney, we begin to see a mosaic not of Hollywood glamour, but of human struggle, resilience, and choice. Each daughter carried the same last name, yet lived vastly different lives. Some sought expression through art, others disappeared into silence. One was lost far too soon, and others continue to live quietly, building families and careers away from the cameras. What unites them is the weight of legacy. To be a Poitier daughter was never a neutral experience. It meant carrying a surname synonymous with history, expectation, and greatness. For some, that legacy was a door half open, offering opportunity but demanding perfection. For others, it was a burden too heavy to bear, leading them to retreat into lives the public would never see. But perhaps that is the deeper truth here. Fame does not guarantee fulfillment, and legacy does not guarantee happiness. Each of Sidney's daughters had to find her own way through the shadows cast by a man larger than life. And in their stories, whether of quiet courage, creative persistence, or heartbreaking loss, we see the full cost of proximity to greatness. In the end, Sidney Poitier's greatest legacy is not just his barrier-breaking career or his iconic performances. It is also the intimate, complicated, deeply human journeys of his daughters. They remind us that behind every legend stands a family, real people with real wounds, triumphs, and truths that deserve to be heard.